Chapter 3 Partners. Harry stared into the hot heart of the fire crackling in the grand fireplace of the Gryffindor common room. He frowned slightly, and the firelight was slowly burning the inside of his eyelids, the black red of dried blood. "Harry," scolded Hermione, interrupting his thoughts. "You're brooding." They were all sitting around the fire, relaxing in their post-feast stupor. He, Hermione, Ginny, and Ron. Harry's frown deepened. Of course, he was brooding. Sure, Voldemort was gone, but that almost created as many problems as it had destroyed. Almost. "What you thinking about, Harry?" asked Ginny. Why did they always ask that? Harry sighed. "Just the usual," he replied, cagey. "Oh?" Ginny cocked an eyebrow impishly. "And what would that be?" Harry resisted the ridiculous urge to stick out his tongue at her. He knew what she was not so subtly referring to. Dumbledore, Sirius, Fred, Dobby, Tonks, and Remix. He spat instead, more coldly than he had perhaps intended. And Hedwig, he thought sadly. The war had resulted in thousands of deaths, and they all weighed heavily on his conscience. Some, those of his friends, more heavily than others. Accordingly, there was a lot of grieving to do. The desire to see Sirius, Dumbledore, Fred, and all of his other friends who died once again was a constant ache behind his eyes, a never-ending clenching in his chest. Ron's face went pinched and slightly off color, as it always did when anyone mentioned the lost Weasley brother. "Hey, mate, I'm sorry," said Harry, more kindly. He hadn't meant to upset Ron. "'S okay," his friend mumbled. "Can you be done brooding for a moment?" Harry shrugged. Beyond the casualties of the war, there were unsettling consequences of its end to deal with. Quite simply, Harry wasn't sure he knew how he wanted to live a life not defined by campaigning against Voldemort. What was his point now? What was to give purpose to his life? And finally, on top of that, there were more mundane concerns hovering over it on the fringe. Classes to worry about for the first time in over a year. Happy couples to envy. It didn't help that one of which was composed of his two oldest friends. And now that Voldemort's absence had given him time to realize it, he was constantly ruminating on the fact that he was... "I know you're like Professor Angst over there, but I think I've filled my personal quota for the day," said Ron, interrupting Harry's thoughts. Harry smiled slightly at that. Ron stretched his lanking frame and yawned. Harry noticed Hermione watching, her skin flushed an expression of absent, and smiled. Then he noticed Ginny watching him with a calculating expression and shot her a reprimanding look. She rallied with one exaggerated innocence. "I'm so glad we did away with old nasty Red Eyes," Ron said. "Now we can sit around and talk about more civilized, important things instead of moaning about him all the time." "And what sorts of civilized, important matters did you have in mind to discuss, Ron?" inquired Hermione, sounding amused. "Quidditch, naturally." Hermione's expression implied that she found this subject to be neither civilized nor important. "And, Ron tried to continue, to salvage himself. "The House Elves debacle?" Hermione rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched at the corners and Harry knew she was fighting with a smile. "So, Mr. Quidditch Captain," said Ginny, nudging Harry's thigh with her foot, "do I get to keep my spot on the team?" "We'll see," quipped Harry. "It depends how you play on the tryouts, doesn't it?" "You have to outfly the competition, just like anyone else. That is, if you can manage it," Harry said with a teasing smirk. He had no doubt Ginny would be able to outfly any competition with ease. "I wouldn't want to appear to be playing favorites, now would I? As a casualty I'm willing to risk." "Oh, are you? How altruistic." Hermione watched their banter with ever so slightly narrowed eyes. "I'm thrilled you've been made captain, Harry," she interjected. "You really need a sort of outlet, I think, to take your mind off things. Force you to have fun again. Voldemort's been gone for months now. It's really high time you start living a normal life, don't you think?" Harry decided not to mention that he had been thinking this exact same thing not a few minutes ago, though with somewhat more cynical edge. He wasn't sure he could live a normal life. He wasn't sure he knew how to enjoy life anymore. Harry Potter? A normal life? Not bloody likely, said Ron, laughing. I agree with Hermione, said Ginny. I've been telling Harry for ages that he should find a someone to date. Have you? Asked Hermione, sounding intrigued and not a little skeptical. Oh, yes. I mean, he's never really had a chance to have a proper relationship, has he? At Harry's look of protest, Ginny rolled her eyes. Cho hardly counts, Harry. Anyway, I think it's a downright tragedy. A stud like Harry deserves to experience the wonders of love if anyone does. Ginny winked and pinched Harry's cheek. Harry glared good-naturedly at her, and Ginny responded with her signature, "You know you love me" smirk. What about you and Harry? Hermione asked, brows furrowed. What about us? Ginny asked, visibly nonplussed. Well, you were dating for almost 5 months. Surely that counts as a proper relationship. Oh, I suppose you're right, allowed Ginny, sounding for all the world as if she thought otherwise. Which, in fact, she did, though Hermione couldn't tell why. But I do agree, falling in love would be just the thing Harry needs this year. I don't think Harry tried to protest. He claims to not fancy anyone, interrupted Ginny, indignant. Harry sighed. He couldn't get a thought or word in edgewise tonight without being interrupted, it seemed. Hermione turned her gaze to scrutinize Harry. Really? Well, we've only just arrived. Perhaps things will change. You do know there are loads of girls who fancy you, don't you, Harry? Are there? Harry truly hadn't known. It wasn't exactly on his radar. Well, I suppose I'm not too interested in them. You don't even know who they are. How can you know you're not interested? Pressed Hermione. Well, I suppose it's just that Ron, who had sat through this conversation with an expression of increasing discomfort plain on his face, finally spoke up, much to Harry's relief. Are we through discussing the particulars of my best mate's love life yet? No, said Hermione and Ginny in unison. Actually, I agree with Ron, Harry said, finally speaking up for himself. You really don't need to worry about me. And please, for the love of Merlin, do not try to set me up with anything or something dodgy like that, Harry said, casting a glance at Ginny, who smiled serenely. I'm happy as I am, really. I just want to enjoy my freedom and appreciate life again, you know? I don't want a lot of fuss or bother, like a relationship. My life has been so fast and complicated for so long. I'm ready for it to be simple. The girls looked unconvinced. Harry sighed. Really, I don't need your help. I'm fine, okay? Anyway, I'm knackered. I think I'll head up for bed. Ginny pouted. Hermione, who was too dignified for pouting, frowned. I'm going to stay here a while longer, said Ron, glancing unconsciously towards Hermione, who smiled. Good night, mate. Night. Draco Malfoy fiddled with his quill, drawing tangled clumps of lines in the margins of his parchment, while he waited for the ever-daft Slughorn to begin class. The old fool was still puttering around, doing Merlin knows what, in what had to be a deliberate attempt to delay class. Draco missed Snape, though he was one of the few who did. Snape had been a brilliant potions master, and a brilliant teacher, and to Draco he'd always been, well, you couldn't exactly call it kind, but he treated Draco with respect, which Draco had always appreciated. And Snape had always started class on time. With nothing to distract him, Draco found himself at loose ends. He began running his hands through his hair in agitation. Draco missed his long hair. He usually wore it pulled back neatly from his face, but just now he was craving the silky swish of hanging it loose against his cheeks and the privacy it would provide, however illusionary. His desire to hide behind his hair wasn't so much because people were staring, though a few were, but rather out of nostalgia, a childish desire to cling to anything familiar. His hair had always been a point of pride for him. He was gratified by its stark white beauty, and the distinct coloring had served doubly as an outward anchor tying him to the Malfoy name. His pride had been tainted in light of his conflicting feelings in the wake of previous spring, which was a large part of why he'd cut it in the first place, as well as it being symbolic of severing all ties to the past and establishing himself in the future as his own person. Nevertheless, his hair would always remind him of his family, such as it was, and now of his forever lost innocence. It was those connotations, especially the latter, that he mourned almost as much as the hair itself. But both the hair and Snape were remnants of that era that, though it had shaped Draco in every possible way, it was better to forget, an era that was now over, thanks to— "Ah, Mr. Potter, how kind of you to join us," said Slughorn, who was now standing at the front of the room. The door had been thrust open suddenly, startling Draco and revealing a disheveled Harry Potter. His black hair was as tousled as ever, his glasses were askew, and he was panting lightly. He had clearly run to class. "Sorry I'm late, Professor. I overslept." "Yes, well," Slughorn gestured for Potter to sit down. Draco smirked. Just a couple of years before, this flimsy excuse would have been enough to see Slughorn bending over himself to pardon his prize student. But those days were over, and had been since the spring of their 6th year. From one day to the next, Potter had been demoted from Golden Boy to being brutesquely tolerated. It hadn't escaped Draco's notice that his change in their student-slash-teacher relationship happened to coincide with a significant decline in Potter's potions performance. Neither did Draco's attuned ears miss the whispers that the shift had to do with Potter being caught using some book to gain advantage, though Draco had never gotten the full story. Potter scanned the room, looking for a free seat. His eyes eventually fell on the empty seat next to Draco, and he shot an earnest look of appeal towards Slughorn. Draco took a glance for himself, and, yep, this was the only empty seat in the room. Figures. And, of course, the great Harry Potter would not care to sit next to a suspected former Death Eater. Not that it ever came to that, of course. The simple fact was that he was Draco Malfoy was enough to deter Potter, alliances aside. Potter's appeal was to no avail. Slughorn gestured again that Potter should take the seat. Potter glanced at someone else in the room, probably the Weasley girl, whom Draco had spotted before, turning back to the professor. "But, sir," he protested. "Now, Potter," said Slughorn, impatient. Jaw clenched, Potter obeyed and sat down stiffly next to Draco. Draco bristled. He hadn't been good enough for the friendship of the boy who lived back when they were young, and now it appeared he wasn't even fit to be desk mate of the Chosen One. "Your desk mate will be your partner for the term," Slughorn announced. Potter fixed Draco with a swift glare, as if this arrangement had been his doing. "Well then, make that not fit to be potions partner of the Chosen One." "To be fair," allowed Draco, continuing his interrupted line of thought. While Potter's aversion to Draco had been unjustified back as 11-year-olds, it was now not without cause. But still, that he, Draco Malfoy, could be unworthy to share space or words with one such as Potter, Draco felt the underlayers of his skin heating with the ire of this familiar rivalry. "To refresh your minds, I would like you to work with your partner to classify the items on this list." Slughorn flicked his wand, and a list of about 100 words filled the blackboard. "Into categories, according to use, species, location, properties, whatever you choose. Marks will be received for the efficiency and precision of your categorization, so choose wisely." How banal, thought Draco. Yet he straightened in his seat to face the task. Daft professor or not, potions was still his favorite subject. He turned to Potter, who was leering at him. "Still eager to be the teacher's pet, eh, Malfoy? I thought that had only been a thing for Snape, but—" Potter shrugged, as if to signify he couldn't possibly predict the twisted preferences of Draco's mind. "Sorry you couldn't partner with your girlfriend, Potter. Maybe if you're on time to class every once in a while," he said, rather than dignifying Potter's comment with a rebuttal. "But our hero needs his beauty sleep, doesn't he?" You do look especially well-groomed this morning, if I do say so. Shut it, Malfoy, spat Potter, his voice hot. You don't even know the half of it. Don't I? Draco raised an eyebrow. Care to enlighten me? Potter narrowed his eyes and knotted his lips. Draco expected him to change the subject again and avoid the provocation, and so was taken back when he said instead, Ginny's not my girlfriend. Isn't she? Draco asked with a mock concern. What a shame. I seem to remember her writing you such a lovely sonnet not too long ago. How'd it go again? Oh, yes. His eyes are as green as a freshly speckled toe. His... Boys, said Slughorn, pausing at their table. Stop bickering and get back to work. 5 points from each Gryffindor and Slytherin for being off task. Well done, Malfoy, Potter hissed. Once Slughorn was out of earshot. I could say the same to you, Potter. Potter's eyes narrowed. Something about the familiar action irritated and soothed Draco at the same time. Now, I don't suppose you know how to go about categorizing those ingredients? Draco absorbed Potter's indignant silence with a smug satisfaction. Ah, I thought as much. And I suppose you do, huffed Potter. Naturally. Here, why don't you write and I'll dictate? That will probably be easier than making a charade of discussing the answers, and you'll at least look like you're assisting, though I'm sure my handwriting's far neater. Ah, well, can't be helped. Like Merlin, I will. They were done with nearly half of the class to spare, and Slughorn grudgingly had given them top marks. Potter simmered in silence for the rest of the class, clearly resentful that Draco Malfoy had single-handedly gotten him the best marks he'd likely received since his falling out with Slughorn. At least, in this one thing, he was superior to Potter. Draco gloated.